Are we living our own desires? The fire flickers softly, casting a golden hue across the room. Outside, the night is still, the kind of quiet that makes you reflect, that brings forgotten questions back to the surface. And I wonder, how many of my choices have truly been mine? We all live our lives believing we are in control. That the things we chase, the dreams we nurture, the paths we take, they are ours, built from our own desires. But are they? Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." How much of what I have wanted was truly born from within me? And how much was shaped by the silent weight of expectation, by the unseen hands of culture, family, and society? I think back to the choices I made as a child. The things I wanted before the world told me what was acceptable. Before I learned the language of approval and validation. Before I understood that some dreams are rewarded and others are dismissed. At what point did I start filtering my desires? At what point did I begin asking, is this reasonable? Instead of, is this what I truly want? We grow up with a script, though we rarely realize it at the time. We absorb it through glances, through words left unspoken, through the quiet conditioning that teaches us what is right. Be successful. Be practical. Choose stability over passion. Seek approval before authenticity. And so we do. We walk paths that feel safe, that look familiar. We tell ourselves this is the way it has to be. That anything else is reckless, childish, naive. But what if that script was never ours to begin with? Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, speaks of the absurdity of life. He writes about how we move through the world, fulfilling roles, meeting expectations, chasing goals, until one day something shifts. We wake up and ask, why? Why am I doing this? Why do I want what I want? Do I even want this at all? There was a time in my life when I believed that wanting something wasn't enough. That dreams had to be justified, had to be weighed against logic and external validation. And so I let go of things I loved. I silenced parts of myself that didn't fit. I shaped my desires into something more acceptable, something more palatable. And I called it being realistic. But realism is not the absence of dreams. Realism is simply the ability to take a dream and shape it into something tangible. It is the bridge between desire and action, not the absence of either. How many of us mistake fear for wisdom? How many of us bury our truest desires, not because they are impossible, but because we are afraid of wanting them too much? Psychologist Eric Fromm argued that modern society conditions us to choose security over freedom, that we become afraid of true autonomy because with it comes responsibility, the responsibility to shape our own lives, to stand by our own choices, to own both our successes and our failures. How many of us have traded freedom for comfort? How many of us have built lives that feel safe but not true? There is a story in The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. A young shepherd follows his personal legend, despite the voices telling him to take the safer road. His journey is filled with obstacles, with doubt, with moments of loss. And yet, with each step, he comes closer to himself. But how many of us abandon our journey before it even begins? How many of us convince ourselves that it was never meant for us? I have often wondered, what if I had chosen differently? What if I had listened to my own voice instead of the voices around me? Would I be standing somewhere else now? Would I feel more at home in my own life? Or does every path, no matter how it begins, eventually lead us back to ourselves? Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychologist, once wrote, "The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." But how can we exercise that freedom if we do not first acknowledge our own desires? If we do not separate the voice within from the voices around us? Perhaps the real challenge is not finding the right path. Perhaps the real challenge is trusting the one that calls to us in the quiet. Tonight, as the fire burns lower and the embers glow softly, I ask myself again, am I living my own desires? Or am I simply fulfilling someone else's expectations? And if the answer is the latter, then perhaps it is time to begin again. Are we living our own desires? The weight of expectations is subtle. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not demand. It whispers. It comes in the form of a raised eyebrow when we express an unconventional dream, in the hesitation before we tell someone what we truly want, in the unspoken fear that if we choose differently, we may lose the approval of those we love. How many of us have carried that weight without even realizing it? How many of us have made choices not because they felt right, but because they felt safe? I think of all the moments I stood at the crossroads of choice, the times I hesitated, the times I convinced myself that desire alone was not enough, that logic, practicality, and the comfort of certainty were more important than the quiet pull of something unknown. But was it really logic? Or was it fear disguised as wisdom? Psychologist Abraham Maslow spoke of self-actualization, the process of becoming who we truly are. He argued that most people never reach this stage, not because they lack the ability, but because they are too busy fulfilling the expectations placed upon them. We learn early on to prioritize belonging over authenticity. We learn that it is easier to be accepted than to stand alone, and so we shrink parts of ourselves. We mute our own voices. We convince ourselves that a dream unchast is a dream that was never meant to be. But what if belonging should never come at the cost of the self? What if the greatest tragedy is not failing in the pursuit of a dream, but never allowing ourselves to try? There is a passage in Man's Search for Meaning where Viktor Frankl speaks of those who live life passively, who never confront their own desires, who follow the easiest path and call it fate. But fate is not something that happens to us. Fate is shaped by the choices we do or do not make. And when we refuse to choose for ourselves, someone else will choose for us. I think of all the people who once dreamed of something different, the ones who had a quiet passion, a longing, an idea that lit them up from the inside. And I think of how many of them let it go, because someone told them it wasn't practical, because they were afraid to fail, because they did not trust themselves enough to try. And I wonder, how many of us are living in the aftermath of decisions we never truly made? Paulo Coelho once wrote, "When you want something, all the universe conspires in helping you to achieve it." But I don't think the universe works in grand, obvious ways. I think it speaks in whispers, a chance encounter, a book that falls open to just the right page, a conversation that lingers in your mind long after it ends. Signs, small, quiet signs. But how often do we ignore them? How often do we dismiss what we feel as coincidence, as foolishness, as something too fragile to be real? There was a time I believed that everything I wanted had to be earned through struggle. That desire alone was not enough. that wanting something for the sheer joy of it was indulgent, selfish, naive. And yet, when I look at the people who truly live, they all share one thing in common. They did not ask for permission to want what they wanted. They simply pursued it. Not without fear, not without risk, but with a quiet certainty that a life lived in someone else's image is no life at all. I wonder, what would happen if we stopped waiting for permission? If we stopped apologizing for the things that set our souls on fire? If we stopped explaining our dreams, justifying them, shrinking them into something more acceptable? What if we simply allowed ourselves to want what we want? I used to believe that time was infinite, that there would always be another day, another chance, another opportunity to finally choose myself. But time is not infinite. There is no guarantee that tomorrow will offer us the same choices as today. So why do we wait? Why do we hesitate as if the life we truly want is something we must earn instead of something we are simply meant to live? Psychologist Jordan Peterson once spoke about regret, about how the most painful moments in life are not the things we tried and failed, but the things we never dared to attempt at all. Regret is not the weight of failure. Regret is the weight of all the lives we never allowed ourselves to live. Tonight, as the embers glow in the dimming firelight, I ask myself again, am I living my own desires? Or am I simply moving through the life that was built for me? And if the answer is the latter, then what will I do about it?